What's up guys, Romsicle here, and today we're taking a look at 3 super smooth switches, the Tealios V2s, the Gateron Ink Blacks, and my personal favorite, the Gateron Yellows, to see which switch comes out on top. So all 3 of these switches are super smooth straight out of the box, and they're even better when lubed. But first, let's get into the pricing. The Tealios V2s are the most expensive at $1 per switch, Gateron Inks are 75 cents per switch, and the Gateron Yellows are the cheapest of the bunch at 24 cents per switch. And the difference really adds up, because if you're building a 60% keyboard, you're paying $60 for switches for Tealios, $45 for the Gateron Inks, and only $15 for the Gateron Yellows. So with the money you spent on Tealios switches, you could literally get 60 Gateron Ink switches and 60 Gateron Yellow switches. As far as switch specs, the Tealios switches have an actuation of around 50 grams and a 67 bottom out force. The Gateron Ink Black switches have a 60 gram actuation and a 75 gram bottom out force. And the Gateron Yellow switches have a 50 gram actuation force and a 62 gram bottom out force. And all of them have a 2mm actuation distance and a 4mm bottom out distance. When taking a look at the switches themselves, the housing of the Tealios V2s look the best. It's transparent, has a gold spring, and it has a nice Tiffany colored stem for a good contrast. Meanwhile, the Gateron Ink Blacks are also transparent, but it has a smoked tint to it, so it's not as see-through, and it has a silver spring and a black stem to complete a stealthy look. The Gateron Yellows are by far the most normal, with a transparent top housing and an opaque bottom housing with a colored stem on a silver spring. When it comes to stem wobble, the Gateron Inks have a surprisingly large amount of motion compared to the other two. And the Tealios V2s have a shockingly low amount of motion, which is a pretty incredible feature. And if you're someone who wants some good backlighting, the Tealios V2s are definitely the best at diffusing the most light across the board, with the Gateron Yellows coming in second, followed by the Gateron Inks. Especially without the keycaps, you can tell how much brighter the Tealios V2s look thanks to the transparent housing. And even under the keycaps, you can obviously see a difference the housing makes when interacting with the surface mounted LEDs. Now let's talk about the typing experience. They all feel great. They're super smooth, not scratchy, and because they're linear switches, you don't hear any noise other than the clack because it goes straight down. For my typing test, I found that the Tealios V2s were the quietest of the bunch, while the Gateron Yellows were the loudest. And I assume this is because it's a lot more difficult to bottom out on a Tealios switch because of the spring tension, and even if you did bottom out, you would typically get a softened clack noise unless you have really heavy fingers. I also found that the Gateron Ink switches sounded almost the same as the Tealios V2s, but just a tad bit louder, but they could potentially sound exactly the same after a longer break-in period, especially after lubing them. And I'll let you guys hear the differences yourselves. So what's the verdict? Are the expensive smooth switches better than these cheap smooth switches? Yes and no. As mentioned before, you are spending an extra $45 on the Tealios switches over the Gateron Yellows, or $15 over the Gateron Inks. And with that money saved, you could buy desk films, you could buy a lube, you could buy golden springs, you could buy a whole bunch of stuff to make the switch better. And then you have the debate of whether you should buy a cheap switch and upgrade it with all the money that you saved up, or buy an expensive switch and upgrade it just a little bit, such as adding lube to it. But honestly, if you're going to be using that much money to upgrade a cheap switch like a Gateron Yellow instead of buying a Tealios switch, you could always go right in the middle with the Gateron Ink switches and just lube those, and you would still be saving some money and be still getting a lot of good performance and sound. The Tealios switches definitely have a better housing than everyone else in terms of quality and LED diffusion, which is always a plus. The Gateron Ink housing is surprisingly similar to the Tealios V2s, but apparently with the version 2 of the Gateron Inks, the quality is even better or even on par with the Tealios switches. And yes, the Tealios V2s and the Gateron Inks are quieter, but I feel like the Gateron Yellows could potentially be quieter if it had a heavier spring. But maybe I'm wrong, because the spring properties are fairly similar to the Tealios V2. If that's the case, then all the difference is in the housing. And the thing about the housing in the Tealios V2s is that Zeal doesn't disclose what kind of polycarbonate nylon blend that they're using, so maybe that's the difference between a cheap Gateron Yellow switch versus a high quality Tealios V2. All three of these switches are insanely smooth, and scratchiness is so temporary that it's almost instantly gone after lubing them and maybe 5 to 10 minutes of typing tests. It's that smooth. If the Gateron Inks did have a clear transparent version, it would obviously beat out the Tealios V2s because it's a better bang for your buck. However, all the switches that we're talking about here are made by Gateron. Tealios are made by Gateron, Inks are made by Gateron, and the Yellows are made by Gateron. So in a sense, you're seeing the lineage of what a linear switch could be. From a cheap Gateron Yellow switch, upgraded a little bit to become Gateron Ink switches, upgraded a little bit more to become the Tealios V2s. So obviously the Inks are not going to be having a clear transparent version because it would directly compete with their highest end Tealios V2s. With all that being said, I would still recommend the Tealios V2s because the quality is there, the backlighting is there. It's just an overall great switch that's fundamentally and aesthetically awesome. So what do you guys think? What's the best switch out of these three smooth switches? Let me know in the comments down below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace.